the Buddha, he had a very striking metaphor for mindfulness of bodily movement. Try to imagine a marketplace in India, and a very beautiful woman is dancing on a scene, and the audience is just men, and they are so excited. They're so excited. Oh, the most beautiful lass in the country, she's dancing, she's dancing. And then the Buddha says, imagine a man who holds his life dear. He has to walk in through that crowd with a bowl full to the brim of oil. And he has to walk in such a way that he does not spill one drop, because if he does, a man who walks just behind him with a sword raised in his hand will cut off his head. Now, consider, the Buddha said, how would that man walk? How would that man walk if his life was dear to him? So, of course, walking meditation is dimensional. Maybe you can walk fast. I mean, if you're a ballet dancer, you have a highly developed kinesthetic intelligence. You can walk fast without spilling a drop of this bowl if you were going to balance with such a bowl in your hand. You can actually do a little test at the next time you're drinking coffee. Fill a cup to the brim with coffee, and then try to walk around in the hall, and if you have to walk at such a slow speed that you don't spill a drop of coffee. Now, this is the ideal of the walking meditation, and there are, of course, nuances. Like when 100 people have to walk out of the door, we cannot walk that slowly, we have to walk fast. And when 100 people, they line up in the queue in the eating hall for food, we have to move fast also. And please do that. The lower limit of the walking meditation is to walk at a speed so you won't be somewhere else in your thoughts. But it's really the kind of walking meditation we'll practice outside of a retreat. You know, like walking down the street. It's a fine rule of thumb. Don't ever walk so fast that you all of a sudden switch over to autopilot and just let your thoughts wander. I mean, the faster we move, the less control we have over our mind, because what we do tend to become automated. And the slower we move, the greater sovereignty over our mind we achieve. So when you move very slow, you can catch the onset of the wandering mind and just pull it back to the walking. But if you walk fast, maybe you don't catch the wandering thought. So try to experiment a little with how slow or fast you have to walk in order to maintain mindfulness of this present moment in which you're walking. The higher limit of mindfulness of body is to walk so slowly that there's not one thing you are not aware of. And then that image of walking with a bowl full to the brim of some liquid applies. And you can do mental notes when you walk, just as an aid to keep your focus. So you can make 3 mental notes, one for each of the movements of a leg. At the moment you lift your leg, you're lifting your legs, you repeat with the inner voice of your mind, lifting, moving, placing. And then you don't move the other leg before you have placed the first leg, lifting, moving, placing. That slow, if you walk that slow, you're very mindful. So try to experiment with this. As I said, one of the purposes of walking meditation is to maintain the development of concentration. And this you do when you walk so slowly. And then later on, as I've already mentioned, we generalize this intensive awareness into other activities like eating. And the recipe is the same. Because our attention is selective, we can only increase it in one focus at a time. And the slower we move, the more apparent this condition of attention becomes to us. That's another kind of insight into the nature of attention. So whenever we go over to the eating hall, it's a matter of bringing the concentration we've developed here with us and into our eating. And as you become more and more aware that you can only sustain your attention in one focal point at a time, then you apply this wisdom to your eating. And try to start developing insight into the impermanence of your sense impressions while eating, the impermanence of taste. Taste is a very fleeting phenomenon, but you have to concentrate around. You have to focus all your awareness on it, and you cannot do this if you're reaching out for your glass of water at the same time. You know, when you divide your attention, and when we divide our attention, we reduce it. And you don't have to be so mindful all the time, but try to do it at intervals. And an important part of sustaining mindfulness in your daily activities is to renew your intention to be mindful. Because whenever you forget to be mindful, I mean, you're out of touch with this intention, with this decision you made that you would be mindful. So you have to renew it, reflect on it again. I want to eat with mindfulness. I want to walk with mindfulness. I want to walk from here and over there with mindfulness. And then when you get over there, maybe you won't walk just so mindful anymore, but try to do it for intervals. And of course, the more aware we become, we cannot avoid seeing into the impermanence of what we are aware of. And that's really where the Buddha's Dharma begins.
Tonight I wanted to talk a bit about what mindfulness is and what it isn't. Because a lot of what's presented as mindfulness is not necessarily really mindfulness. The word in English is very prosaic. You know, there are words like love and compassion and wisdom, which the word themselves have a kind of spiritual uplift. Mindfulness, just the word, it kind of lands like a thud. It's not very sexy. However, the mind state that it refers to is extremely complex and nuanced. And so to ask what is mindfulness It's a bit like asking, what is art? Or what is love? Not so easy to say in just a few words what it is. So the first response that people might have if you ask, what is mindfulness? Maybe the first response would be living in the present moment. Not being caught up in thoughts of past, thoughts of future. So that's a good start. In order to be mindful, we need to be in the present. However, being in the present is not enough. Are you familiar with the dogs, the Labrador Retrievers, Black Labs? Or it could be any dog, but I have a particular fondness for them. Very playful, very active, a lot of fun to be with. These Black Labs are in the present moment. They are completely in the moment. Basically being led around by their nose. It doesn't look to me like they're very mindful. They're in the moment, they're not in the past, they're not in the future, but it's not yet mindfulness. Mindfulness is something more than that. So then we might say, well, mindfulness is being in the moment, but it's also a certain observing power in the mind. When we're observing what's happening in the moment. Usually in our lives, we're most concerned with the content of our thoughts. We're most concerned with the story, whether it's stories about ourselves, stories about other people, stories about the world. I think it's very rare, very few people in the midst of all this thought activity, stop to inquire or stop to observe or ask the question, what is a thought? Not what is the thought saying, but what is it as a phenomenon? It's a very interesting aspect of our experience. Have you ever stopped to ask that question? What is a thought? That has nothing to do with the story. That's just, as thinking is going on, if we're observing it, and then we ask, what is a thought? It's very interesting. Because thoughts, unnoticed, have tremendous power in our lives. Thoughts are like little dictators in the mind. Go here, go there, do this, go do that. And we're like the slaves of thoughts. And yet, when we ask the question, what is a thought? And we're really, in the moment of thinking, we're looking at its nature, we see that it's little more than nothing. It's just this little ephemeral bubble of energy that comes in. There's no substance whatsoever to the thought. So isn't this interesting? That when it's unnoticed, it has this tremendous compelling power in our lives. And when it is noticed, we see that there's hardly anything there. I find this completely fascinating, and to see how often we give the thoughts power and they affect our lives, and yet in the moment of waking up from being lost, the whole story disappears. So mindfulness, this one aspect of mindfulness, the observing quality, the observing power, helps to wake us up. So when thoughts are there, we're observing them rather than lost in them. There's another domain of observation which is very interesting. For most people, it's the predominant aspect of our experience. And that is the whole domain of seeing. Seeing is, for most people, the predominant sense door. And as with thoughts, mostly we are lost in what is being seen. Right? We're inhabiting that reality, not paying attention, not observing the fact that we are seeing. We're often not mindful. So I'll give you a few examples of the liberating power of becoming mindful that we're seeing. So just one little story. This happened a while ago. I was in New York City and walking down one of the avenues that has a lot of fancy shops, of Fifth Avenue. Beautiful, beautiful things in the windows. And I was just walking by and my eye was caught by all these nice things in the windows. You know, we call it window shopping. Oh, that's nice. Oh, that's nice. That's nice. And I wasn't noticing that that's what was happening. I was just kind of caught up, in that kind of desire, and I didn't even realize it was there. It just so happened that a few weeks later I was on the same street, walking down the same blocks, but for some reason the second time I happened to just be mindful that I was seeing. And I noticed the difference in my experience. It's like the first time it was enjoyable. I was enjoying that, that would be nice. I wish I had that. And the second time I was walking completely at ease. I was seeing the same things. But because I was aware that I was seeing, this heart-mind wasn't reaching out, it wasn't clinging, it wasn't grasping. It was just seeing. Big difference. And it was such a powerful lesson in what the Buddha referred to when he said mindfulness is the guardian of the sense doors. Right? If we're mindful at each of the sense doors, if we're observing, if we know, when we're seeing, we know we're seeing. When we're hearing, we know we're hearing. That mindfulness guards the sense doors so the mind doesn't get caught up, in these frequent and useless and at times unskillful patterns. Okay, so we could say mindfulness is living in the present, but that's not enough. Right? So we don't cultivate black lab consciousness. So it's the observing power of mind. But in the way the Buddha taught mindfulness, it is always a wholesome state, which means that in every moment of genuine mindfulness, there is no greed, there is no hatred, there is no delusion. So it's talking about an observing power of mind that is always wholesome. One of the meanings of the Pali word sati is to remember. So in the context of mindfulness, mindfulness remembers what is wholesome, what is skillful, and what is unskillful. Most people, I think, who have not spent time looking inward and investigating and trying to understand their hearts and minds, perhaps are not paying so much attention in their lives to recollecting, to remembering which states of mind are wholesome, which are unwholesome. Usually we're just so busy, caught up in our lives, we're simply acting out the familiar patterns of conditioning. But the Buddha said and suggested, remember, call to mind what states are skillful, what states are unskillful. And it's very simple. The Buddha made it very simple for us. He said all the unwholesome roots, all the roots of all the unwholesome states come down to either greed, pulling in, aversion, pushing away, or delusion, just running around in circles. So we can really keep an eye out for those. And to notice the skillful states of mind, of generosity, of love, of wisdom. In the Satipatthana Sutta, the Buddha's discourse on mindfulness, the instruction is very simple. When greed is present in the mind, know that greed is present. When aversion, when delusion is present, know that they are present. When non-greed is present, know non-greed is present. So we actually have to pay attention to the quality of our mind in different experiences. So mindfulness is being in the present, but it's more than being in the present. It's the observing power of mind, but it's more than simply observing. It's observing free of these defilements of mind. It's observing through a wholesome state of mind. Without greed, without the wanting, without the aversion, without the delusion. There's one teacher from Burma who's teaching now in the West a lot. His name is Sayadaw U Tejaniya. He has his own particular method of teaching, but one of the things he suggests, which I found very, very helpful, is that we should check the attitude in our mind. Whatever our experience is, whether it's of the body, of thoughts, of emotions, of sounds, whatever's arising in the moment, he emphasizes check the attitude. And that's a very useful reminder for us, so that we can begin to see, are we relating to whatever it is free of greed, hatred, delusion, or are there aspects of those unwholesome states, are they acting as a filter through which we're seeing? Well, what's the attitude in the mind? We can ask this question, very often it's not even to get an answer. Just by asking the question often reveals the filter that may be there. We want to ask this question not only with things, as usual in our practice as the breath. We certainly want to do it with unpleasant sensations or emotions like fear or like pain. Last night I think I mentioned that teaching, which is so strong, that what we frequently think about and reflect becomes the inclination of the mind. That's why it's important that we are mindful of the mind states that are present. Because those are the ones, either knowingly or unknowingly, that are being strengthened. I just wanted to highlight this evening some of the nuances, so we're really clear about what this very powerful force in the mind is. We have a little time, if you like, just for a few questions, if you have anything about the talk.
Would you please expand on delusion, greed, hate, delusion?
Delusion is when we don't know what's going on. We're not even recognizing what's going on. With greed and hatred, we may be recognizing what's there, but it's through the filter of grasping or pushing away. In delusion, well, a good example of delusion is when we're lost in a thought. Right? The thinking is there, but we don't know that we're thinking. We're just caught up in it. And so the Buddha described delusion as like a net of delusion that we're caught in. Right? And we're not seeing clearly what's arising. Another meaning of delusion, so this is the kind of very practical experience of it, in our practice when we don't know what's going on. But another meaning of it in the Buddhist teachings is ignorance about the nature of things, ignorance of the Four Noble Truths. Right? It's a kind of delusion. So it's both on a cognitive level and also on that experiential level of not knowing what's present. As a shorthand for recognizing when greed or hatred or delusion is present in the mind, as a shorthand for recognizing these filters through which we're observing things, you could think of it, and one teacher expressed it this way: greed is pulling in. Hatred is pushing away. Delusion is running around in circles. So pulling in, pushing away, running around in circles. Pay attention, and check in. Use that suggestion of checking the attitude in the mind. Use that very often. You can use it 5 or 6 or 7 times in a sitting. You can use it in a walking. You can use it in the dining room. What's the attitude in the mind now? In Vipassana practice, in mindfulness practice, we want to be opening to an understanding and investigation of the nature of the whole range of our experience.
One way to understand the practice of Vipassana as far as the state of mind in the meditation is concerned is the understanding of the 5 spiritual faculties, the Indriyas. The faculty of investigation, of mindfulness, of concentration, of energy, and faith, or rather confidence. These faculties are balanced in different ways, whether we are doing samatha or vipassana. In samatha we develop concentration up to a pretty high degree, and it can sometimes block for the investigation faculty, so we don't see properly into the nature of the object we are concentrating on. So it is important to balance these faculties. Sometimes one of them or 2 of them are in excess. For instance, we can have too much faith actually. Sada, it doesn't really mean faith. It's often translated as faith, but it means more like confidence, the kind of confidence which is a prerequisite for learning anything. If you don't have confidence in that you can learn to meditate, you won't try. So we have to have that proper level of confidence, but not faith, really, not if you have faith in something in the sense of just having blind faith, you don't really try to test the theory. You actually are here to test. I mentioned it the very first day. If you sit down and look into your mind, the whole of the Buddha's teaching will unfold itself to you. Now, this is very nice to believe in, but if you just have blind faith in it, you won't test it, and then you won't practice very much. Then you'll go early to bed every night. Huh? You have to have confidence, but also a little bit of skepticism. You know, that level of skepticism which makes you very curious about whether this theory really is true. You know, I have to test it. I'm not completely convinced on the outset. I have to test it. So if you have too little confidence, the same thing happens as when you have too much faith. You go early to bed at night. You know. And the same thing applies to an excess of the faculty of investigation. That sort of comes out as too much intellectual understanding. Intellectual wisdom, but too much, really. You know, I have a perfect understanding of this. I don't really have to test it because I know my theory is right. I know what Moninja said, because it's perfectly true. Don't have to test it. So I go early to bed also. You know. And of course there has to be a balance between energy and concentration, because if there's too much concentration and too little energy, I may go to sleep in the meditation. The energy oozes out of the state of meditation, and I begin to doze, and I go to sleep right there. And if there's too much energy and too little concentration, the mind becomes restless. Then I stay up all night, but without meditating. I'm tossing to and fro in my bed. So there has to be this balance between the faculties, and it's mindfulness that makes this balance. It's our awareness of our awareness. When we are becoming aware of our awareness, we can change our relationship to our awareness.